This is Maryland Morning with Sheila Cast. I'm Nathan Sterner, and the sound you're hearing behind me is the sound of the Gwynns Falls along the Gwynns Falls Trail. The Gwynns Falls Trail snakes some 15 miles along the Gwynns Falls stream to the Middle Branch to the inner harbor of the Patapsco River. It's taken centuries for what was once virgin forest to become the park we know today. And joining me today for a look at the history of this vital park is W. Edward Orser, professor of American Studies at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and principal author of the new book called Gwynns Falls, Baltimore Greenway to the Chesapeake Bay. Good to have you here.
Well, nice to be here, Nathan. We're at a spot overlooking the stream in the midst of glorious woodland on a beautiful fall afternoon when you might think that you were in the mountains of western Maryland or West Virginia. You would have no idea that you're well within the city limits of Baltimore. People often ask, what about this name? After all, it's the Gwynns Falls. Isn't it the Gwynns Falls River or the Gwynns Falls Stream? Well, the early English settlers and explorers, when they first came to this region, noticed that some of the streams in this area tumble down from the Piedmont Plateau heading toward the coastal plain. And as they did, they had to fall down over a series of rock rapids. And so instead of calling them rivers, as we might sometimes call a body of water like this, they called them falls. So
the whole stream is the falls.
Exactly.
It's not just a specific place that is the falls.
Where there's a single falls.
But this whole thing is the falls.
And if you're at many points along the trail, you'll notice here's another falls, here's another rapids.
I guess let's walk back, if that's okay with you.
Okay, sure.
Back when Baltimore City was chartered in 1729, I think it was, Gwynns Falls Trail was not part of Baltimore. This area was just out in the boonies. What was this place like then?
Almost all of the area the trail goes through at that point was really rural area. And the part we're in now, which is the upper part of the trail, did not become part of the city limits even until 1918. By which point there was beginning to be development along the ridges, along Edmondson Avenue, along Windsor Mill Road, but this still was very far outside of where most people in Baltimore lived.
There was development early on what's now the lower part of the park, though, right?
There was, and the lower part, in the early years as Baltimore grew, what happened on the edge of the city was that some of the least desirable functions were there. So there was a hair factory that used animal hair to stuff mattresses. There were butchers, there were stockyards.
All of which had their effluent running into Gwynns Falls.
They did. All the waste products went into the Gwynns Falls. So the Gwynns Falls was, this may be not an elegant way to put it, but it was almost an open sewer. And that, of course, was a great tragedy. It really wasn't until 100 years ago that the city really began vigorously to acquire what became Gwynns Falls Park, all the way from Wilkins Avenue to Frederick to Edmondson, and then on up to Windsor Mill Road, and then in the 1940s Leakin Park. So there's this really wonderful amount of preserved parkland in the upper part of the trail, but the lower part already had been quite severely impacted.
Now the connecting of all these trails to some extent started in 1904 when the Olmsted firm was called in to deal with our city's parkland?
Yes, and I don't know how familiar everyone is with with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. Perhaps if they do know a landscape park designer, that's the one they know.
Central Park, right?
Central Park was his signature park, and eventually was called in to do park plans for many cities that had aspirations to be great cities. In 1903, that was an aspiration of Baltimore leaders, and they brought in his firm. Sadly, by that point, he was quite elderly. In fact, he died in 1903. But his son came in, Frederick Jr., and conducted a plan for Baltimore City that in particular said, you've got a wonderful set of assets here in these stream valleys, and as the city grows, it would be in your best interest to secure those valleys as parkland, because if you don't, development's going to happen. It's going to erode the valleys. It's going to create all kinds of problems. I think they made the argument in a kind of interesting way. They said this land is beautiful, but it also is practical for you to acquire the land. In other words, they were very good business people. And they said, if you don't acquire it now, it's going to cost you later. And I think we really owe a lot to those leaders over the last 100 years who had the vision, because in 1903, this still was way out where we are now, was way outside the city limits, but the city was anticipating annexation.
You're listening to Maryland Morning here on your public radio. I'm Nathan Sterner, walking along the Gwynns Falls Trail in western Baltimore with Ed Orser, whose newest book tells the story of the history of the trail.
Here come some bikers. Hi there. Beep beep. Having a good time? Yeah, good. We're seeing some fairly typical users today. We're seeing dog walkers, we're seeing joggers, we're seeing bikers. Some from the neighborhoods, some from farther away.
What is now the Gwynns Falls Trail starts from up at the end of I-70, goes down to the Inner Harbor. How did it all become connected as it is now?
Well, I think it's a fascinating story because we've talked about the Olmsteds and their vision back 100 years ago, which set the path, and working with city leaders. I mean, it's not that they came up with the idea out of the blue. They obviously studied what were the city's needs, and they sort of laid the footprint, and the city began to follow through with acquiring parts of the valley. And by the 1940s, they had acquired this upper part a good bit for parkland. But when I came here, frankly, which was the late 60s, this was really not just sort of woodland park or sometimes called wilderness park. It was frankly neglected park. It really was sort of out of sight, out of mind. But then in the early 90s, a young intern from the forestry school at Yale was down here working with the Department of Recreation and Parks. He rediscovered that Olmsted plan and envisioned that perhaps by connecting those parklands, acquiring a few parcels that had not been acquired for parkland in the past, one could create a connected space all the way through the northwest side of the city, all the way to its water side. What really happened in the early 90s and through the 90s was the creation of a really exciting coalition of people who believed in this idea and really wanted to make it happen.
When did this trail get finished?
The last mile and a half of what's, at least for now, the complete trail was opened in June of this year. That connects to the park and ride at I-70, which now provides a very convenient place for people not only to park, but to understand how they can access the trail if they're coming from the west as opposed to coming from the harbor or middle branch.
So essentially, while the trail has been being developed over centuries, it's just now become what it is today, become the full 15 miles people can access.
Absolutely.
Now we're just about to cross a bridge that runs over a dead run, and when the Gwynns Falls Trail was being designed, the bridges were actually the most expensive part of the trail, right?
Yes, and I'm not an engineer, I'm a historian, but as part of the planning team, I learned from engineers and architects that the bridges really are the most expensive element, and the particular bridge we're looking at was the very first one erected. It's really quite long. What would you say, 100 feet at least?
At least.
At least that, and it's a lovely kind of arched bridge. And I know that when we first looked at that, it's a small, the stream here is very small. It looks like it's maybe 12 feet wide, and you say, why do you need that kind of bridge? But when the flooding occurs here, this stream swells way over its banks.
The stream may be 12 feet wide now, but it's the full 100 feet wide when there's a lot of rain.
And 2 weeks ago, it was way up over those banks. So they have to plan for what they call a 100-year flood expectation. And in order to do that, you have to build what's really a very substantial bridge.
You can really see what all that extra water washes into Dead Run. There's all sorts of bags and a piece of a road sign sticking in the brush.
And it's what would you say, 10 to 12 feet above the stream level?
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of hard to imagine that a little stream like this, which right now is just a pretty little stream with clear water, but
right now you could walk across it without getting more than your ankles wet.
Exactly, but it just gushes through here. And then when there's special events like hurricane rains, bridges, are often washed out. So they really have to build very carefully in a place like this.
Who's in charge of maintaining these 15 miles of trail?
This is a park. It's under the jurisdiction of the Department of Recreation and Parks. So the Recreation and Parks assigned some staff people to take care of the Gwynns Falls Trail. And they do a wonderful job, but I will put in a plug here that Baltimore parks are severely underfunded. And there's simply not the staff that's needed for this kind of operation. So they work valiantly, but whenever you're out, if you see some litter that they've not been able to get, pick it up yourself.
Now, speaking about funding for parks, Baltimore City had a unique method of funding parks back in the early 1900s, a tax on trolleys.
That was a very interesting and very innovative and very progressive measure they had to fund parks. When the city acquired Druid Hill Park, which was at that time actually outside the city limits, north of the city, was right at the very time when some of the earliest trolley lines were getting started, and a number of trolley lines aimed to make Druid Hill Park a destination for city dwellers. The early streetcar tax was 1 cent out of 5. The fare was 5 cents. 1 cent went to parks.
So really, 20% of what people were paying to take the trolley was going to maintaining parks.
And when you put it in that percentage terms, it really sounds really quite considerable, and indeed it was. It really allowed the parks to expand. But sadly, in the 1930s, when those trolley lines went bankrupt, the tax went kaput. And as all of us know, and we know certainly now in financially hard times, when you're looking at priorities, sadly, parks often are not highest on the list. The result is that parks are in many places underfunded, and I think Baltimore is no exception.
We're now at the trailhead to the Gwynns Falls Trail at the terminus of Interstate 70, and Interstate 70 almost spelled the end of this park.
Yes, it would have gone right down this valley. What we're looking at right now are about 8 lanes of concrete.
And these 8 lanes of concrete come to an abrupt stop right here where the trail begins.
Which is the city line, and a lot of people are quite mystified. Why does the roadway stop? The roadway stopped because a coalition of people in Baltimore from various neighborhoods converged together to form an organization to fight the expressway and to come up with what they hope will be a more sensible set of plans. That battle, some people called Baltimore's Vietnam, and the battles really came to a head in the late 60s and early 70s.
And now that the battles have been fought and won in terms of Gwynns Falls at least, we have these parks to enjoy.
Well, from my perspective, thank goodness, now someone who's coming down this road at 70 miles an hour and thinking in 10 more minutes I could be downtown might have a different thought. But I think it's really in some ways very ironic. At the point where we're sitting, we're looking west at 8 lanes of concrete and a sign up the way that says that this road goes to Utah, and behind us is a hiker-biker trail that goes through a beautiful woodland valley, and that would not have been possible had the expressway not been stopped.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for sharing the Gwynns Falls Trail with us today.
It's been a real pleasure. I hope that people will get out and discover what a wonderful treasure we have right here in Baltimore.
That's W. Edward Orser, American Studies professor at UMBC, author of the new book, Gwynns Falls, Baltimore Greenway to the Chesapeake Bay, and a note that all proceeds from that book benefit programs here at the Gwynns Falls Trail. We'll have a link to the book and more on how you can enjoy the trail on our website, marylandmorning.org. I'm Nathan Sterner for Maryland Morning with Sheila Cast. Thanks for joining us.